The air in the Quonset hut that housed Vance Agri-Solutions smelled of three things: new paint, fresh rubber, and Larry Vance's ambition. It was a sharp, chemical smell, the perfume of 1976. On the polished concrete floor sat a brand-new John Deere 4630, its green hide so glossy you could see the fluorescent lights reflected in the hood. It gleamed under the buzz of the overhead lamps like a fat green god of harvest, promising easy power and a future free of busted knuckles. Jedediah Stone stood just inside the massive rolling door, letting his eyes adjust. The glare off the new machine was almost blinding compared to the honest sunlight of the May afternoon. He wasn't here for the 4630. He wasn't here for the easy credit terms Larry Vance had scrawled on a chalkboard behind his metal desk, terms that looked more like a prayer than a business plan. Jed was here for a specific hydraulic filter, a Wix 51762, for the Detroit diesel that powered his own beast. Larry spotted him from across the showroom floor. He slicked back his hair, a nervous habit that betrayed the practiced ease of his smile. He was a salesman down to his bones, a man who believed progress could be measured in monthly payments. "Jed, good to see you, my friend. Don't tell me you're finally ready to trade in that old relic and step into the modern age." Larry's voice boomed, a little too loud, designed to be overheard by the two other farmers kicking the tires of a new disc harrow. Jed gave a slow nod, his gaze not leaving the hulking green tractor. "Just need a filter, Larry, for the Detroit." Larry chuckled, walking over and clapping Jed on the shoulder. Jed didn't flinch, but he felt the softness of the man's hand. It wasn't a farmer's hand. "A filter. Jed, my man, you're putting a Band-Aid on a wooden leg. Look at this." He swept his arm towards the 4630. 150 horses at the PTO, sound guard body, air conditioning, AM/FM radio. You can plow 100 acres and not even break a sweat. Think of the time you'd save. "My bud'll pull anything that thing can and then some," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact. His tractor wasn't a John Deere. It wasn't a Case or an International. It was a big bud. A 1972 HN 320 he'd bought used for cash from a big wheat operation up in Montana that was upgrading. It was a simple, brutal machine, built with steel plate you could measure with a yardstick and powered by a two-stroke 8V71 Detroit diesel engine that screamed a song of pure, unadulterated power. It didn't have a radio. It didn't have air conditioning. The cab was just a box to keep most of the rain off. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of the 30 gallons of oil in its crankcase was paid for, just like the 640 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. Power isn't the issue, Jed. It's efficiency. It's comfort. It's about leveraging your assets, Larry said, lowering his voice into his confidential, conspiratorial pitch. Land prices are going through the roof. The government's backing farm loans at 4%. You could buy up the old Hemlock place, double your acreage. This 4630, a new planter. You'd pay it all off in 5 years with the price of corn what it is. You're sitting on a gold mine, Jed, and you're trying to dig it out with a shovel. Mark Peterson, one of the farmers by the harrow, wandered over. He'd bought a new International 1066 from Larry last year and acted like he'd invented farming. "He's right, you know, Jed," Mark said, wiping a thumb over the John Deere's pristine tire. "My 1066 runs circles around that old farmall I had. I did my North 80 in a day and a half. Used to take me 3. Jed looked from Larry's eager face to Mark's smug one. He saw the gleam in their eyes. It wasn't the satisfaction of a job well done, it was the fever of the gambler on a winning streak. They were betting on the future, a future of ever-rising prices and ever cheaper money. They were betting the farm, literally. "I don't borrow," Jed said plainly. The words fell into the air and seemed to suck the energy out of the room. It was a phrase so foreign to the thinking of 1976 that it sounded like it came from another language. Larry's smile tightened. "Jed, that's old-time thinking. Debt is a tool, just like a plow. The smart guys, the ones who are going to survive, they know how to use it." "A tool that can cut both ways," Jed replied. He turned his back on the new green tractor. "You got that filter or not?" Larry's posture changed. The salesman vanished, replaced by the irritated parts manager. Yeah, Jed, in the back. I'll go get your antique part for your antique tractor. As Jed waited at the counter, he could hear Mark and Larry talking in low tones. He caught snippets. Stubborn fool. Gonna get left behind. His daddy was the same way. Jed didn't let it bother him. He'd heard it all before. At the co-op, at the diner, even at church. Jed Stone, the man who time forgot. The man who'd rather spend a week rebuilding a transmission than sign a 5-year note. They saw him as a relic, a living museum piece. They didn't understand. It wasn't about being stubborn, it was about sleeping at night. It was about knowing that the rain on his roof fell on a roof he owned, not one the bank held the paper on. It was about the deep, quiet satisfaction of turning the key on an engine you understood down to its last washer. An engine that would run for you because you cared for it, not because you were still paying for it. Larry came back and slapped the filter box on the counter. $12.50. Jed pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and counted out the cash. Crisp bills earned from his own sweat, not the bank's ink. As he walked out, the smell of new rubber fading behind him, Jed thought about the path he was on, and the one Larry was selling. They were two different roads heading into the same future. And before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening to this. Standing there in 1976, with cheap loans being handed out like candy and commodity prices hitting record highs, what would you have done? Would you have listened to the Larry Vances of the world and signed on the dotted line for that shiny new 4630? Or would you have walked out with your paid-for filter in your hand, trusting in the old iron you knew and owned? Drop a comment below and let me know which path you'd have taken back then, because the choice they made would determine who was left standing when the music stopped. The breakdown came 2 weeks later, right in the middle of planting. It wasn't the engine. The Detroit was as solid as the day it was built. It was the transmission. Jed was pulling a 30-foot chisel plow through the heavy clay of his west quarter, the 8V71, singing its high-revving two-stroke song when he felt it. A lurch, a sickening shudder that vibrated up through the steel floor of the cab, followed by a high-pitched whine that cut right through the engine's roar. He immediately pushed in the heavy clutch pedal and pulled the throttle back. The whine quieted, but it was still there, a ghost of a sound hiding beneath the engine's idle. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who knows his machinery intimately, that something deep inside the Clark 5-speed had let go. He managed to limp the big bud back to the yard, the transmission screaming in protest with every turn of the tires. He parked it on the concrete slab in front of his workshop, the big double doors gaping open like the mouth of a cave. The silence that fell when he shut down the engine was heavier than the machine itself. It was the sound of lost time, the sound of corn that wasn't getting planted. Mark Peterson drove by on the county road in his gleaming International, pulling a brand new planter. He slowed, leaned out of his air-conditioned cab, and gave a little wave that was more pity than greeting. Jed just nodded back, already pulling a floor jack into position. For the next 4 days, Jed's world shrank to the space under that tractor. The first day was diagnosis and disassembly. The transmission on the HN 320 was a monster, weighing the better part of a ton. He had to split the tractor. He used the big A-frame hoist he'd built himself from old oil field pipe, wrapping chains around the bell housing and rolling the front half of the articulated tractor forward on its massive tires. Once it was open, the smell of burnt gear oil, acrid and bitter, confirmed his fears. He spent the rest of the day pulling the transmission itself. It was a greasy, brutal ballet of breaker bars, impact wrenches and pry bars. Every bolt was a battle. Every casing was heavy enough to crush a man. By nightfall, the massive Clark gearbox was sitting on a reinforced dolly on his workshop floor. His wife, Sarah, brought him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, her face etched with worry. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Bad enough," he said, not looking up from his work. "But it's just steel. It can be fixed." The next day, he tore into the gearbox itself. He was meticulous, laying out each gear and shaft on a clean workbench in the exact order they came out. He found the culprit soon enough. A main shaft bearing had failed, a catastrophic failure that had sent shrapnel through the case, chipping teeth off third gear and its corresponding cluster gear. The parts were ruined. This was where the difference between Jed's world and Mark Peterson's became starkly clear. If Mark's transmission went out, he'd call Larry Vance. A truck would come, haul the tractor to the dealership, and a team of mechanics would install a factory new or rebuilt transmission. Mark would pay the bill with a signature, adding it to his operating loan. Jed didn't have that option. Big Bud wasn't like John Deere. The company had been sold and restructured. Parts for a '72 model weren't sitting on a shelf somewhere. So Jed got on the phone. Not the kitchen phone, but the greasy, battle-scarred rotary phone he kept mounted on the workshop wall. He started with a salvage yard in Fargo. The guy laughed. A Clark 5-speed for an old Bud. Son, you'd have better luck finding a hen's tooth. He tried another yard in Kansas. Nothing. A place in Nebraska had a whole transmission, but they wanted $8,000 for it, and they couldn't guarantee its condition. $8,000 was more than Jed had paid for his last pickup truck. It was out of the question. He spent the better part of a day on the phone, his ear sore, his frustration mounting. The sun beat down outside, perfect planting weather, and his fields lay black and empty. The community was watching. He knew what they were saying at the diner. See? That's what he gets for running that old junk. Should have bought that new Deere. Pride's gonna make him lose his crop. The scorn was a physical thing, a weight on his shoulders as he worked. He felt it in the way neighbors' trucks seemed to slow down as they passed his lane. He felt it in the silence on the party line when he picked it up to make a call. He was an island, and the tide of modern agriculture was rising around him. Finally, late on the third day, he got a lead. A man named Gus, who ran a heavy equipment repair shop in eastern Colorado, had heard of a similar Big Bud that had been wrecked and parted out years ago. He thought the transmission might have ended up at a small family-run salvage yard outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming. He didn't have a number. Just a name, Gus said. Miller's Iron, Old Man Miller. Don't know if he's even still alive. Jed spent an hour with the Wyoming phone directory and an operator before he found a listing. A woman answered, her voice old and thin. Yes, her husband Frank was still alive. Yes, they still had the yard. She wasn't sure about the part. Jed would have to come and look. He didn't hesitate. He told Sarah he was leaving, threw a sleeping bag and a box of tools in his Ford F-250, and started driving west. He drove through the night, powered by coffee and sheer determination, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a countdown clock against his planting season. He arrived at Miller's Iron just after dawn. It wasn't a salvage yard so much as a graveyard, a sprawling, rust-colored testament to forgotten machines. Old Man Miller was a wisp of a man with hands gnarled into claws by arthritis, but his eyes were sharp. "Big Bud transmission?" he rasped. "Yeah, I remember that. Pulled it myself back in '74. It's out back, somewhere." For 6 hours, Jed and the old man walked the iron graveyard. They climbed over mountains of scrap, past derelict combines and skeletal bulldozers. Finally, half buried under a pile of rotting tires, they found it. A massive, rust-covered transmission case, the same Clark model as his. "There she is," Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. $100, you haul it." Jed paid the man $200. It took him another 2 hours with a chain hoist and the old man's rickety forklift to get the thing loaded into the bed of his pickup. The Ford sagged on its overload springs, but it held. He drove home, every bump in the road a prayer that his leaf springs would hold. He got back to his workshop well after midnight on the 4th day, running on fumes. But he didn't sleep. He fired up the overhead lights, hooked the transmission to his A-frame, and started tearing it down. He worked with a surgeon's focus, cleaning 30 years of grime off each part. The bearings were shot, but the case was sound. And the gears, the crucial third gear and cluster gear, were perfect. He spent the next day and a half rebuilding his own transmission with the donor parts from Wyoming, replacing every seal and bearing with new ones he'd ordered by mail. He worked until his hands were raw and his back screamed in protest. Finally, it was done. He slid the rebuilt gearbox back into the Big Bud's frame, reconnected the two halves of the tractor, and filled it with fresh fluid. With Sarah watching from the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, he climbed into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The Detroit diesel roared to life, filling the workshop with its glorious, deafening noise. He let it warm up, then eased the clutch out and shifted into third gear. There was no whine, no shudder, just the smooth, powerful engagement of meshing steel. A slow smile spread across Jed's face. He had won. It had cost him a week of planting time, a trip to Wyoming, and more sweat than he thought he had in him. But he had won, on his own terms. The boom rolled across the heartland like a slow golden wave. The years between 1977 and 1980 were a dream. Russian grain deals, soaring exports, and rampant inflation pushed commodity prices to heights no one had ever seen. A bushel of corn wasn't just a bushel of corn anymore, it was a piece of paper you could take to the bank. Farmland that had been $200 an acre a decade ago was now selling for $2,000, and everyone was sure it was headed for $3,000. It was a fever, and Larry Vance was fanning the flames. His dealership, Vance Agri Solutions, became Vance Agri Empire. He built a new, bigger showroom with glass walls. He added a second and then a third service bay. He was selling tractors as fast as the factories could build them. He wasn't just selling iron anymore, he was selling the dream. He had a finance guy in his office full-time, a man who could get anyone a loan, no matter how much they already owed. "The bank loves farmers," Larry would say with a wink. "Your land is the best collateral in the world. It's not like they're making any more of it." Mark Peterson was his star pupil. Fueled by Vance's easy credit and the bank's bottomless optimism, Mark's operation exploded. He bought the 320-acre Hemlock Place when the old man passed. A year later, he bought another 160 acres to the south. He tore down his old farmhouse and built a sprawling new brick ranch-style house with a 2-car garage. His wife drove a new Lincoln. He traded in his 1066 for a brand-new International 1486 and then bought a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger Cougar to go with it. He was farming nearly 1,200 acres. At the diner, men spoke his name with a kind of reverence. He was the future. He was the man who had figured it out. When he saw Jed, he'd slow his new pickup and lean out the window, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Jed, you're working yourself to death on that little patch of ground," he said one afternoon at the co-op. "There's never been a better time to expand. You're letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass you by." Jed just nodded. "I'm doing all right, Mark. Making a living." "A living?" Mark scoffed. "Jed, we're not just making a living anymore. We're building wealth, equity. My net worth has tripled in 2 years, just on land values alone." Jed didn't see it that way. He saw the new equipment sitting in Mark's yard, gleaming in the sun, and he didn't see assets. He saw liabilities. He saw monthly payments that were bigger than his own yearly property tax bill. He saw a man who was betting everything on the hope that the music would never stop. Jed's life didn't change much during the boom. The high corn prices were good, no doubt, but he didn't see the extra income as a windfall to be leveraged. He saw it as a buffer, a wall to be built against the lean years he knew were as certain as winter. He paid his property taxes 5 years in advance. He replaced the roof on the old barn. He bought a new Lincoln arc welder for his shop and a heavy-duty lathe. He put the rest of the money in a simple savings account at the bank, earning a modest 5% interest. The bank manager, a young man with a fresh MBA, shook his head. "Mr. Stone, this money is dying in here," he'd said, looking at Jed's passbook. "Inflation is running at 12%. You're losing money every day. Let me show you some investment vehicles, or we can use it as a down payment to expand your operation." "I like it where it is," Jed said calmly. "I can get it when I need it." He was seen as a dinosaur, a fool. The other farmers thought he was scared, that he didn't have the nerve for the new way of farming. They didn't understand the peace that came with his discipline. He still worked his 640 acres, he still drove his old Ford pickup, and he still ran the Big Bud. He spent the winters meticulously maintaining it, treating the machine not as a disposable tool, but as a partner. He rebuilt the injectors, line-bored the engine block himself on a machine he'd bought at an auction, and gave it a fresh coat of paint. It ran better than it ever had. It was a monument to his philosophy: own what you have and take care of what you own. The end of the good times didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It was a whisper on the wind. It was the fall of 1979. Jed was in his workshop late one night, machining a new bushing for his planter, when the radio on his workbench crackled to life with a news report. A man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, was speaking. He used words Jed didn't fully understand, words like monetary policy and restricting the money supply. But he understood the man's core message perfectly. Volcker was declaring war on inflation, and his primary weapon was going to be interest rates. A week later, Jed was at the bank to deposit a check from the grain elevator. He overheard the young manager talking on the phone in a hushed, urgent voice. "What do you mean the prime rate is going to 15%? All our agricultural loans are variable. They're tied to the prime rate." A cold knot formed in Jed's stomach. He looked out the bank's big plate glass window across the street to where Mark Peterson's shiny new pickup was parked. He thought of Mark's 1,200 acres, his 2 new tractors, his big new house. All of it bought with money borrowed against a future that was, at that very moment, beginning to curdle. Jed walked out of the bank and looked up at the clear autumn sky. The harvest was in, the bins were full, and the price of corn was still high. On the surface, everything was fine. But Jed knew a storm was coming, a financial hurricane the likes of which none of them had ever seen. And he knew that when it hit, the only thing that would matter wasn't how much you were worth on paper, but how much you owed the bank. The whispers that began in the fall of 1979 became a roar in the winter of 1980. President Carter, responding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, announced a grain embargo. The primary customer for America's bountiful harvests was suddenly cut off. The news hit the heartland like a physical blow. The price of corn, which had been the foundation for every loan and every dream, didn't just fall, it plunged through the floor. Suddenly, the numbers on the bankers' spreadsheets and the dealers' contracts turned from black to a deep blood red. For Jedediah Stone, the news was grim but not catastrophic. His bins were full of paid-for corn. He could afford to hold it and wait, to sell only what he needed to cover his modest living expenses and property taxes, which were already paid years in advance. For his neighbors, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Their operating loans, taken out when corn was $3 a bushel, were now due. But the corn in their bins was worth barely $2, and falling, they would have to sell nearly twice as much grain just to break even, and most of them couldn't. The first real crack in the new world of farming appeared in Mark Peterson's yard that spring. He was trying to get his fields worked with his 2-year-old Steiger Cougar, a 4-wheel drive monster that made Jed's big bud look almost modest. Jed was on his own northern fence line, replacing a rotten post, when he saw the big Steiger sitting silent in the middle of Mark's field, a quarter-mile away. It sat there all morning. Around noon, he saw the distinctive white service truck from Vance Agri Empire pull into the field. A young mechanic in clean overalls got out, carrying a briefcase full of diagnostic tools. Jed watched from a distance as the mechanic hooked wires to the engine and scratched his head. The tractor didn't move. It sat there for 2 more days, a monument to motionless power. Jed finally saw Mark at the co-op, buying a bag of bolts. Mark looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were bloodshot, and the confident swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. "Tractor trouble?" Jed asked, keeping his voice neutral. Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Trouble? That's not the word for it. It's the hydraulic remote control valve. Some fancy electronic solenoid in it failed. The kid from Vance's has been out 3 times. They can't figure out if it's the solenoid, the wiring harness, or the main control board." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "They have to order the parts from the factory in Fargo. The control board alone is $2,000. $2,000 for a little box of wires, and they can't even guarantee that's the problem. The tractor's been down for 3 days, Jed. 3 days, and it's gonna rain tomorrow." Jed just nodded. He thought of the simple steel levers and direct mechanical linkages that controlled the hydraulics on his big bud. If something broke, he could see it. He could weld it, machine it, or fabricate a new one. He didn't need a computer to tell him what was wrong. "They'll get it figured out," Jed said, offering what little comfort he could. "Yeah, they'll figure it out," Mark spat, his voice thick with resentment. "And send me a bill for $3,000 for the privilege. That's on top of the $4,000 payment that's due next month. And the bank just sent me a letter. My interest rate on the operating loan just went from 9% to 18%. 18%, Jed. How in God's name is a man supposed to make a living? Mark threw the bag of bolts onto the counter and stalked out, the bell on the door jingling behind him like a funeral chime. A few weeks later, Jed had to go to Vance's dealership himself. He needed a new set of V-belts for the Detroit's alternator. The change in the place was shocking. The vast, gleaming showroom, once a cathedral of optimism, was now a tomb. The same tractors that had been there last fall were still sitting in the exact same spots, but now they were covered in a fine layer of dust. The big chalkboard behind the desk that used to scream low 4% financing was wiped clean. Larry Vance wasn't on the showroom floor. Jed found him in his office, staring at a mountain of paperwork under the harsh glare of a desk lamp. Larry looked older, smaller. The slick hair was uncombed and his tie was loosened. The smell of ambition had been replaced by the stale scent of cigar smoke and anxiety. "Jed," he said, his voice flat. He didn't even try to sell him anything. "Need a set of belts, Larry?" Larry sighed and pushed himself up from his desk. "Yeah, I think we got some in the back." As they walked through the silent parts department, Jed could feel the weight of the place. It was the weight of unsold inventory, of interest payments compounding daily on millions of dollars of iron that nobody could afford to buy. "How's business?" Jed asked, just to break the silence. Larry stopped and turned, and for a moment the mask of the salesman fell away completely. Jed saw a man terrified, cornered. "Business? There is no business. The bank called my note. The floor plan note from Deere. They want their money. The farmers have no money. Corn's in the toilet, and the interest rates, my God, the interest rates. It's like they're trying to kill us all." He looked out the grimy window of the parts room at the rows of silent green and red tractors. "I did everything they told me to do. I expanded. I leveraged. I built this place into the biggest dealership in 3 counties. His voice broke. "And now I'm going to lose it all. I'm drowning, Jed. We all are." Jed took the belts and paid for them with cash, just as he always had. As he walked out the door, he looked back at Larry Vance, a man who had sold the future so convincingly that he had forgotten to prepare for the present. The turning point had passed. This was no longer a storm on the horizon. They were in the heart of the hurricane now. The winter of 1981 was the coldest anyone could remember, but it wasn't the frost on the windows that chilled the county to its bones. It was the silence. The cheerful roar of new tractors had been replaced by a quiet dread. The mailboxes, once stuffed with seed catalogs and equipment brochures, now held thin, formal envelopes from banks and law offices. Foreclosure notices, once a rarity whispered about in hushed tones, were now tacked to the doors of the county courthouse, a public roll call of the fallen. The farm crisis was no longer a matter of balance sheets and interest rates. It was a plague. It hollowed out families, turned neighbors into strangers, and left a landscape dotted with abandoned farmhouses and auction signs that flapped in the bitter wind, like prayer flags for a God who had stopped listening. Mark Peterson's auction was on a Saturday in early April. The sky was the color of lead, and a cold drizzle fell, turning his neatly gravelled yard into a muddy soup. Half the county was there, not out of spite, but out of a grim, morbid curiosity. Like townspeople gathering for a hanging. They walked through the mud, their faces grim, looking at the machinery lined up in neat funereal rows. The giant Steiger, its hydraulic problems, long since fixed at a ruinous cost, sat beside the International 1486. The big disc harrows and the 24-row planter looked absurdly large and optimistic in the grey light. Everything was for sale: the tractors, the implements, the grain trucks, even the Lincoln town car and the workshop tools. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket. He wasn't here to bid. He was here to bear witness. He saw Mark standing on the porch of the brick house he had been so proud of, a house that no longer belonged to him. He was a ghost at his own funeral, his wife standing beside him, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, tried to work up some enthusiasm, but his patter fell flat against the wall of silent misery. The bidding was slow, pathetic. Machines that Mark had paid $100,000 for just 2 years ago were selling for $20,000, $30,000. The buyers were mostly other farmers, men who were themselves hanging on by a thread, picking over the bones of their neighbor's failed dream for a bargain. The worst part was the banker, who stood beside the auctioneer with a clipboard, ticking off each sale, his face impassive. Every dollar went to him. Mark wouldn't see a dime. When the Steiger came up, a silence fell over the crowd. It was the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The auctioneer started the bidding at 50,000. Silence. He dropped it to 40. More silence. Finally, a low bid came from the front, 25,000. The banker nodded grimly to the auctioneer. The gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. Sold, for a quarter of its value. Mark visibly flinched on the porch as if he'd been struck. Jed couldn't watch anymore. He turned and walked back to his truck, the mud sucking at his boots. He hadn't felt a shred of triumph, only a profound and hollow sadness. He had survived, but he was no longer sure what that meant in a community that was dying around him. His own farm was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. The high interest rates that were a death sentence to his neighbors were, for him, a strange sort of boon. The money he had stubbornly kept in his simple savings account was now earning 15, then 17% interest. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a steady stream of cash flowing in, not out. While others were selling off their corn at a loss to make interest payments, Jed sold his grain only when the price ticked up, using the cash to buy fuel and supplies for the coming year. He spent his days in the fields, working the same 640 acres he always had. The Big Bud was his constant companion. Its old Detroit diesel engine, with its simple mechanical injectors and gear-driven blower, didn't care about the prime rate. It only asked for clean fuel and oil. As Jed plowed his black earth, he'd see the repo men driving down the county roads, hauling away his neighbors' tractors, planters, and combines. Each one was a green or red casualty of a war fought with spreadsheets instead of swords. The sound of his tractor became a strange comfort to the few who remained. Its steady, screaming roar, echoing across the valley, was a sound of persistence. It was the sound of something real and solid in a world where wealth and security had proven to be illusions. He was Jed Stone, the man who time forgot. But in the wreckage of the 1980s Farm Belt, it turned out that being forgotten by the times was the only thing that had saved him. By 1983, the landscape of the county had been permanently altered. The names on the mailboxes had changed. Where the Peterson farm had been, a new sign read, Consolidated Ag Investments, Inc. The brick house was empty, its windows boarded up. Corporate farming, financed by distant money, had moved in to buy up the foreclosed land for pennies on the dollar. The sense of community, of neighbors helping neighbors, had been replaced by a quiet, stoic isolation. The final nail in the coffin of the old way was the auction at Vance Agri Empire. The dealership had been limping along for 2 years, a ghost of its former self, until the bank finally pulled the plug. The auction was held on a hot, windy day in August. The rows of dusty, sun-faded tractors were the same ones that had sat there for years. The glass walls of the showroom were grimy, and weeds grew in the cracks of the vast parking lot. Jed went, not to buy a tractor, but because he'd heard the shop equipment was being sold off. His old hydraulic press was starting to leak, and he knew Larry had a newer, heavy-duty 50-ton model in his service bay. He found the press and stood by it, waiting for its turn on the block. He saw Larry Vance across the crowded workshop. He was a different man entirely. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap work shirt and worn jeans. He was thin, and his face was a roadmap of stress and failure. He wasn't talking to anyone. He just stood against the wall, watching with dead eyes as the auctioneer sold off the pieces of his life's work. Air compressors, welders, engine hoists, specialty tools. It was a brutal, piece-by-piece dismantling of a man's identity. When the 50-ton press came up, Jed was ready. The bidding was sparse. A few local mechanics and another farmer showed some interest, but they dropped out quickly. Jed got it for $400, a fraction of its true worth. After he paid the clerk, he saw Larry still standing by the wall. On an impulse, Jed walked over to him. Larry didn't look at him. He just stared at the empty space where the press had been. "Goodbye, Jed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "That's a fine piece of equipment, built to last." "It is," Jed said simply. He paused, the hot, dusty air thick with unspoken words. There was no room for, "I told you so." There was no victory in this. "Larry," he started, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm going to need a hand getting that press moved and set up in my shop, and I'll be tearing down the Detroit for an overhaul this winter. I could use someone who knows his way around a parts catalogue. It's not much, but it's steady work." Larry finally turned and looked at Jed. His eyes were filled with a confusion that slowly gave way to a flicker of something Jed hadn't seen in years. Gratitude. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. Larry Vance started working for Jed the next week. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Larry never tried to give Jed business advice, and Jed never mentioned the past. Larry's encyclopedic knowledge of parts and machinery was invaluable, and in the quiet, greasy sanctuary of Jed's workshop, he seemed to find a piece of himself he thought he had lost. He found a purpose not in selling, but in fixing. Not in debt, but in tangible, honest work. The community noticed. The farmers who had survived, the ones who were now nursing along 20-year-old equipment because they had no other choice, started stopping by Jed's place. At first, it was for advice. Then, they'd ask if he could machine a new shaft or weld a cracked frame. Jed's workshop, once his private refuge, slowly became the heart of the community's recovery. With Larry handling the parts orders and Jed providing the skill, they kept half the county's old iron running through the leanest years. They didn't get rich, but they kept food on their tables and tractors in their fields. Jed Stone, the stubborn fool, the dinosaur, had become the man everyone depended on. He hadn't just survived the storm, he had become the lighthouse. Years passed, the pain of the 80s faded into a scar, a constant reminder of the lessons learned. The world of agriculture moved on. Tractors became guided by satellites, and combines could measure the yield of every square foot of a field. Corporate farms grew ever larger. But the 640 acres of stone land remained. One crisp October evening, long after the sun had set, an old man sat in the cab of a massive articulated tractor, its paint faded but its steel sound. The cab was dark, save for the faint glow of the oil pressure and temperature gauges. The engine, a two-stroke Detroit diesel, idled with its distinctive, impatient rhythm, a sound that had been the soundtrack to this farm for decades. Jedediah Stone, his hair now white and his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, looked out over the field he had just finished harvesting. His grandson, a boy of 16 with Jed's quiet eyes, sat on the buddy seat beside him. The boy had helped him all day, learning the feel of the old machine, the smell of diesel and earth, the deep satisfaction of a harvest brought in. "She's a good old tractor, Grandpa," the boy said, his voice full of the easy admiration of youth. "But that new one the co-op has, it's got GPS steering and a computer screen bigger than our TV." Jed smiled, a slow, deep smile that creased the corners of his eyes. He reached out and patted the worn steel dashboard of the big Bud. "That it does," he said, "and I'm sure it's a fine machine. But there's a difference, son. That GPS tractor, it's full of black boxes nobody but the dealer can fix. You don't own it. You just make the payments on it. The bank owns it. The company owns the software that makes it run. It's a tool you rent." He throttled the big Detroit up for a moment, and the cab vibrated with the raw mechanical power of a bygone era. Then he brought it back down to a rumbling idle. "This old girl," he said, his voice dropping with reverence, "we own her, every gear, every bearing, every wire. When she breaks, we fix her, right here in our shop. Your Uncle Larry can find any part ever made for it, and I can make the ones he can't. There's no note at the bank, no software license to expire. It asks for nothing but our care, and in return, it gives us everything. It's not about how fast you can go or how shiny the paint is." He shut down the engine, and the sudden, profound silence of the prairie night rushed in. He looked at his grandson, his eyes serious in the twilight. "It's about what you own," he said softly, "and what owns you. Never forget that, because a storm will always come, sooner or later. And when it does, the only thing that will keep your feet on the ground is the ground itself, and the iron you paid for with your own two hands." The boy nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Together, they climbed down from the old tractor, their silhouettes dark against the star-dusted sky. The big bud stood silent in the stubble field, a monument of steel and wisdom, its work done, its legacy secure.